Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Cody Cassidy, author of How to Survive History, How to Outrun a Tyrannosaurus, Escape Pompeii, Get Off the Titanic, and Survive the Rest of History's Deadliest Catastrophes. He's the author of Who Ate the First Oyster, as well as And Then You're Dead, What Really Happens If You Get Swallowed by a Whale, Shot from a Cannon, or Go Barreling Over Niagara Falls, which that's what I'm reading next. So, you wake up one morning, everything seems fine. It's bright and sunny. The weather is lovely. You feel well and rested. You have a comfortable bed and a nice home and a great family. And then all of a sudden, the sky starts to turn dark and you have a little tickling in your throat. And then you hear a rumbling in the distance. And then maybe you see a crowd of people armed coming down the street towards your house, which actually could happen today. It starts getting chilly. You open the window, you look up and you see this bright light getting brighter and brighter. And then the ground starts shaking. So it's funny how one moment in the universe and on our little dot, everything is great. And then either all of a sudden or over the course of a day, a week, a month, years, things change, some in an instant, literally. So Cody explores events in our history that have not only shaped the history, but have upheaved it. And in doing so, he gives us, albeit after the fact, a blueprint for survival. And even though the events and cataclysms that occurred over eons are long gone, his instructions might very well be useful in the event there is an event. So welcome, Cody, and thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So history is tough. I mean,
it can be, especially if you cherry pick the worst events.
Yeah.
I think we often overlook how disastrous history actually was and how tough and violent it could have been. I think the more we look at skeletal remains, the more shocked we are at the age people died and the rate of violence that occurred. Is sort of just, it seems, when we just look at skeletons, for example, and in most of ancient history, the rate of violence sort of equates to what we would think of as a modern war zone, basically. And so that just sort of doesn't even count the disease and malnutrition and stuff. So certainly history was quite brutal and life was short.
Yeah, and if you look at the table of contents, half of them are natural, maybe not half, and half of them are stuff that horrible people did, whether it's, not horrible necessarily, but whether it's the fall of Constantinople or the Donner Party, or Blackbeard for that matter. But it's you do it chronologically, and obviously the earliest ones are where you send somebody back in time and say, hey, if this happened, what would you do? So why don't we may not get through all of them, but why don't we start with, outrunning a T-Rex?
This was actually where the book first started. It was sort of the initial idea was to do a survival guide into the dinosaur age. And then it expanded to include lots of history, because I was initially interested in a study that showed how they looked at T-Rex, and we assumed that he was a fast runner. He was one of the most powerful predators, basically the most powerful predator to ever walk the earth. But it turns out he was so heavy, he could have not lifted both feet off the ground at the same time. He would have sort of snapped his leg bones. So it must have been a fast walker, which means the full-size T-Rex would have been about 12 to 13 miles per hour, which the average human, and I count myself a sort of very middling athlete, could have outrun, could have about paced him. And then if you look at, there's an interesting study which placed accelerometers on cheetahs and impalas and watched how they race. And it turns out the cheetah, even though the cheetah's average is about 53 miles an hour and the impala can only run at about 40, the impala usually wins, and that's because it employs some sort of basic tactics in its running. And if you employed these, I think you would do okay, which is that actually you shouldn't run at your top speed from a predator, even which sounds counterintuitive, but if you run like the impala, which is at about 80% of your top speed, and then wait till they get close and then sort of turn unexpectedly, they'll sort of overrun you, and by doing this repeatedly, you can actually extend the race long enough that your advantages in endurance will win out. I think that was surprising to me until I sort of recalled my days on the playground, outrunning older predators, graders, and I used those techniques. I think I did use those techniques as well. So if you sort of employ that old knowledge, you might you would probably win, at least against the full-size T-Rex. I have to say the
young ones are faster.
Yeah, it turns out the sort of teenagers would be a different story. They run closer to 30 miles per hour, and there's also evidence they probably would have been interested in someone your size, whereas the full-size version was probably hunting Triceratops and other very large animals. The teenagers would not only have been much faster, they would have probably been interested in animals at your size, and that would have been a different story. So if one of those took an interest in you, I would suggest running, or hiding, or climbing a very tall tree, or something else, but running won't work.
One of the interesting things about the book was, it's kind of a metaphor for, I think, human life, is that zigzagging may oftentimes be better than going straight, and running in the opposite direction that you intuitively think is the correct direction may also very well save your life. And it's a good metaphor for, I think, maybe a good metaphor for how you should think about doing things.
Yeah, I think one of the things I learned in researching and writing this book is that unfortunately our instincts aren't often correct, and when it comes to these disasters, then the thing that seems intuitive is what you should not do, which, oftentimes you should have run in the exact opposite direction, like you say, or not run top speed when somebody is chasing you, which goes to show it, planning ahead or studying before these events occur can often be a good idea.
Yeah, it was like when you're talking about the mammoth. I think zigzagging is a great idea for outrunning a mammoth. Just seems obvious to me. But
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think, but how you attack it isn't. Is not. Oftentimes people think you should throw it. You would think you would want to throw it when it was back to you, but that, unfortunately, in terms of the mammoth, would be a bad idea. Would be sort of like firing a spitball at a bully. Its rear is basically impenetrable, and so
the thing about it is that I thought about it really hard about, okay, I could build a spear, not as good a spear as these people did. It just doesn't seem like it's even possible that it would pierce. But then talk about the device that you said can allow a projectile to travel at really fast speeds.
Yeah, it's called an atlatl, or just a spear thrower. It's really simple. It's just a piece of wood that the spear sits on. So it's basically like adding a joint to your arm, because it's hard to describe, but it's really simple. It's just a stick of wood, and the spear sits on top of it, and you sort of throw it. Actually, you see these a lot at dog parks. It's if you've seen one of those toys that you can pick up the tennis ball with, and sort of launch them. It's the same concept. It adds another, it basically extends your arm and adds another point of leverage. So it really accelerates a spear. If you throw a spear, you can't get it much more 20, 30 miles an hour, but people who are good with, if you practice with an atlatl, it doesn't take a real great athlete to get these things up to 60 miles an hour. So that has quite a bit of penetrating power, and they've actually found mammoths with spear points lodged into their bone, which signifies how much force these spears were traveling with.
That was a good example, because talking about people who aren't the greatest athletes, me, I'm 70, I'm 71. So it's like, yeah, I have that flinger for my dog Putney, who's a 100-pound golden doodle. And yeah, I just realized, yeah, I can throw it 100 yards, but not with my hand, but with the flinger, easy.
Yeah, and it's exactly the same concept for the spear. It's just the spears aren't quite what we think. It's whereas like a sort of handheld spear would be as thick as a broom handle. These are thinner, more like darts. So that the design of the spear is slightly different, but it's the very same concept. It's sort of extra joint, and you could really launch it.
Well, if we move forward, I don't know, not 60 million, but close to the Chicxulub asteroid. I like the idea that you put me on the other side of the world, because putting me anywhere else really would make the chapter very short. But describe, I think this is the most fascinating one for a lot of people, especially lay people, when they understand where this thing impacted and what it actually did. So why don't you just recite maybe a few of the things that happened almost instantaneously, and then what happened because the earth was kind of ringing like a bell.
Yeah, this was, a lot of people call this the most spectacular day in Earth's history. It occurred about 66.5 million years ago. And it was an asteroid about 6 miles wide, traveling at about 10 miles per second. So if you would have been in the northern hemisphere, you would have seen it a couple of days beforehand as sort of appearing as a sort of bright new star. And then it would have slowly, the next night, probably been about as bright as the moon, and then it would have been about as bright as the sun. And then it hit just the shallow sea above what is now the Yucatan. And it impacted with about 100 million times the power of the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated. So it basically impacted Earth sort of like you can think of it similarly like a cannonballer into a pool. And the splash initially was about 20 miles high of Earth. And the cavity went all the way down into Earth's mantle. And then it sort of, if you think about when a cannonballer hits, there's sort of that vertical sploosh that rises up, and that was briefly taller than Mount Everest. And so you can imagine the waves that emanated off of this were more than 1,000 feet high around the Gulf Coast. They hit Europe, 600-foot high tsunamis. Basically within 15 hours, tsunami wrapped into every coastline on the Earth. And then, of course, there was also the blast wave, which would have killed you. This is sort of the wave of pressure through the atmosphere, just like a bomb would have killed you if you were in Texas. It would have deafened you if you were as far away as New York, and it would have blown out window panes basically in the entire Americas. And then it sort of got worse from there. As you say, the rock rung Earth like a bell. So basically triggered earthquakes globally, which themselves triggered sort of sea waves and lakes and more tsunamis. And then all of that Earth was about 25 trillion tons of Earth that it sort of launched into the air, some of which it launched at speeds so quickly they exited our gravitational pull and sort of traveling around the stars, even embedded themselves as other meteors on other planets. But most of it fell back down, and it fell back down as it fell through the atmosphere, it burned up. And so it basically rained fire on Earth and ignited forest fires throughout the globe and caused a lot of smoke. Rain actually wicked that smoke down quickly. So that wasn't what caused the most devastating effects. But what it also did is there's a lot of oil in the Yucatan area. That's actually how they first discovered this crater, was oil companies looking around at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico and for oil, and it vaporized this oil, and it started coated the sort of stratosphere in basically a black paint. And because it was above rain clouds, it took almost 10 years for it to finally settle down, and that dropped sunlight reaching the Earth by 90%. So global temperatures fell by almost 50 degrees. This sort of had all sorts of cascading effects, one of which was to basically kill off all the dinosaurs except for a few ground nesting birds and every mammal larger than a raccoon too. So absolutely devastating.
This is the first time we've really talked about it, but like I said, you put down somewhere and the idea is, okay, the idea of the book is, okay, there's a small chance, but if I utilize all these tools, I might be able to survive. Leave the shrews alone because that could affect the future. But yeah, so these guys, the only ones who lived are, you know, animals that could get under the water and burrow in, or really low living creatures, maybe even snakes and shrews and small mammals. But how am I at my size supposed to survive this? If I
Yeah,
could.
so admittedly, this was the probably the one where I really had to push the experts hardest to say that there was even a chance of you surviving. But the best shot would definitely be on the other side of the earth, probably somewhere in what is now Indonesia, and somewhere like near the equator where the temperatures are going to be the warmest and there's still a little bit of rainfall. One of the consequences of sunlight dropping so much is that there's less evaporation, and so there's just severe drought as well. But near the equator, there's still some rain. The temperatures are above freezing. And if you hunt in sort of river estuaries, animals like turtles and are the ones that did the best seemingly, so that you may be able to find something to eat. However, as you said, it's a good idea to avoid this sort of our ancestors, which sort of look like a shrew creature. And it's unknown how many of those survived. So it may have, you would have some devastating butterfly effects maybe if you ate too many of those.
This is totally off topic, which is what I do in these things. Can't help it. But isn't it weird when you think back to like the dinosaurs, how all of us still have femurs, tibias, radius, ulna, a backbone with, you know, everything that their backbone has. Like evolution said, you know, okay, this seems like it's good enough. I'll just keep doing this. Doesn't that seem weird?
Yeah, I think what are they called? There's a word for it. Sort of, we've all evolved around basically the same sort of principles. Eyes too, all sort of, evolution has basically just decided there's the best way of doing it.
Yeah, even when a giant, when these arthropods went extinct, their body structure remained the body structure that essentially both of you and I have today. But
yeah. Yeah, we sort of all trace back to.
I'm off topic. I'm trying to sell your book, seriously. But the next one is the Ice Age, and it's not a question. When I read that, it wasn't a question of how I could survive. It was how anybody could survive. And you talk about the clothes and how they were made, but it's like, how do they were naked before they made the clothes. So how did they have the time to survive long enough to clothe themselves in such a pleasant way?
In the Ice Age, well, they had they certainly did have clothes. It was I focus on this book on the area called the Mammoth Steppe, which is sort of what we think of. Sort of, if you look at a Gary Larson cartoon, this is sort of what everybody sort of thinks of when they think of the Ice Age. These are people sort of living amongst the glaciers in what is now sort of Eastern Europe, Poland. They seem to have gone here mostly in the spring, and they hunted mammoths almost exclusively. There was very little. One consequence of there being sort of massive glaciers was, again, quite a lot of drought, and so it was basically the highlands were almost high deserts, and the only rich areas with a lot of foliage were down by the rivers. And so these groups of people would live on these hills and wait for large mammoth herds to pass through, it seems, and then go into this, basically try to herd one off into a corner and trap it, and then throw lots and lots of spears using what we said atlatls at these creatures. But I found a lot of it. It was I found it very interesting that the fauna in the Ice Age was sort of much more different than you'd expected. There were sort of the animals that you would commonly associate, sort of woolly rhinoceroses, and wolves, but then there were also cheetah and hyenas and sort of this sort of odd mixture of animals that we that we are familiar with but don't associate living next to each other. And they were all sort of mixed into these river valleys and beneath the glaciers.
Yeah, it was strange thinking about equatorial animals living in really cold climates, and then I guess gradually as things changed, drifting down towards the equator, where cheetahs and leopards and hyenas generally hang out. But yeah, it was and also interesting that they pretty much bypassed everything except mammoths. And also you said they weren't going after sick or ill or old mammoths necessarily, which I would have thought they would be.
Yeah, it seems like they would probably go after the female mammoths seem to have been hunted. Male mammoths, particularly in what they call the musk season, are like extraordinarily aggressive. They'll attack trees, basically. They'll attack anything. And so they would try to herd these, probably the female mammoths, into what would look like cul-de-sacs. They found these sort of hunting areas that are surrounded by cliffs or rocks, and areas where they could trap them and then hunted them. But it must have been extraordinarily dangerous, because they were basically similar to elephants in sort of, we assume, in behavior and size. African elephants. And hunting African elephants, even with modern weapons, is dangerous. And so they were using sticks and spears would sort of be, but we can only postulate, really, because there's very little evidences of injuries or of these people. This is 25,000 years ago, so we can only speculate how dangerous it must have been.
So right, so far we've basically been talking about essentially a climate that you're dealing with, but the next one is Egypt and the pyramids, which I still think were built by aliens, not ramps. But because I can't, when I went there and looked at it, I go, nah, it's just like when I went to Machu Picchu. It's like, nah, no way, 80 tons. It's impossible. But in any event, again, without me getting too far off topic, the idea of, talk about how essentially your conscription and the me you send back there, what you tell me to watch out for, but the general person and the entire 1 million person population being totally devoted to this tomb and monument. Talk about how your conscription was basically a tax.
Yeah, it was basically the entire society was of more than 1 million people living in the Nile River Valley were sort of focused on producing these pyramids. And oftentimes people think there must have been slaves that built them, but that wasn't the case. It was the people who did the actual lifting were probably farmers living in the Nile River Valley. And the pharaoh Khufu, in this case, is sort of taking advantage of the unique properties of the Nile, which is that during the summer months, it floods. There's a massive flood, which is from rainfall in sort of equatorial Africa, goes down the Nile and floods the Nile River Valley. And this is what allows that valley to be so productive, because it has so much soil, or so much new soil and minerals and water comes into that area. But it also sort of idles this massive amount of people, because they can't farm their farms during the 3 months while the Nile is up. So during that time, Khufu would conscript them, sort of like a modern military, and their tax would be to go lift rocks for his pyramid. And it seems like there was a lot of sort of esprit de corps amongst these people. It wasn't as if it doesn't seem as if they disliked it, or if it was, if they did, they had a good spirit about them. The reason these were constructed was they believed that the pharaoh needed a place to advocate for them, advocate for rainfall and such amongst the gods. They sort of thought he would sit beside them and advocate for the people of Egypt. So it was sort of in their interest, they believed, to build these massive pyramids amongst the desert. And so they would be, there's all these like graffiti in the pyramids. They sort of called themselves teams. So sort of one of them was like Khufu's drunkards and stuff. So it doesn't seem as if it was, certainly not built by slaves, and maybe even sort of a fun summer camp. Well, maybe
Yeah,
not fun,
no, it's like,
but
like when you have teams at trivia night, at a bar or a softball league, something like that. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
it's so funny. There's so many horrible things that you could incur there. And you say this twice in the book. It's just the idea of wearing sandals that really bothered me because I kept thinking of like stubbing your toe and how much that hurts. And if you drop one of these things on your foot, whether you were wearing shoes or not, but it was just that it was sandals. And you seem to feel the same way.
It's terrifying. I mean, this is some of these, the rocks average a couple of tons, and the biggest one is 80 tons. It's sort of the roof of the Pharaoh's chamber. It's an 80-ton piece of granite that was actually quarried almost a few hundred miles up the Nile River, where they're sort of, and then they shipped it down, and then just pulled it 210 feet above the ground on a ramp. And as you say, they did it all without, and then wedged it into place, which is unimaginable in and of itself. But yeah, with exposed toes, is just horrifying.
All right. So, okay. The next one is another one that's, not people essentially enslaving people, but it's Pompeii. And it really struck home for me because when I went to Pompeii, it was just amazing. And because as you talk about, many, if not most of the people died without even knowing they were about to die, which is why they're in the positions they are, either a couple in a loving embrace or hanging with his dog, next to him. Talk about Pompeii, and also how you say you can get out of there. You can't get out. I don't think you can get out.
Yeah, well, as you said, you've been there. The mountain absolutely looms over Pompeii, which is why it's only 5 miles away, and which is why it's sort of unimaginable that anybody could have survived. But they did, and it all sort of depends on what you did in the very first beginnings of the eruptions, because when it first started to erupt, actually it was the safest time. It's sort of when it was about 10 a.m. early in the morning on sort of August 24th in 79 AD. And it began to erupt with when a volcano first cracks its vent. It's when the bubbles sort of the CO2, just like when you're cracking a soda bubble, first sort of come out of solution. And this actually gives the volcano a lot of power. It shoots its what they call a Plinian cloud almost into the stratosphere. And so this is when ash starts falling on Pompeii. And what you did with that is sort of determines whether you'd survive or not. Some people ran, and some people took cover from this falling ash. At first, it's just sort of it fell like a snow, which and it wasn't particularly dangerous. But over time, over the next couple of hours, a sort of dangerous process took place, which is that as less and less, as more CO2 left out of the magma, it became denser and denser. And what happens is it, instead of rising into the high atmosphere, the cloud rises a few hundred feet and then sinks and rolls down the mountain, sort of like a sandstorm, and it moves at sort of 80 miles an hour. It's 1,800 degrees. It's so dense you can't actually even breathe in it. And that's how and the people who stayed in Pompeii were hit by this. It's sort of in the afternoon, and that's the sort of the remains that we see. So you actually could have survived if you ran when that eruption first began. But sort of the surprising thing is the wind was blowing towards Pompeii, which is actually why the ash first fell there. So it would be better because you have just enough time if you ran towards and past the volcano towards Naples, and you'd have about 5 hours before the really dangerous phase of the volcano arrived, and you'd have to make it about 13 miles. So that's like about a sort of a jogging speed. And if you could maintain that and you kept yourself well hydrated, because it's quite hot in the middle of August in that part of the world, you would make it.
I always wonder about Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger. Why were they always hanging around everything? But then I realized the reason why is because they wrote it, and that's what we read. It's like It's like if you go to the supermarket and see the same person all the time, it's like, why are they always here? But they're also thinking, why are you always here? But those guys are always, who's the guy who was walking through Rome after the sack of Rome, the famous guy, and said, Rome is no more. Who was that guy?
Oh man, I don't know.
Somebody
It could have been, there was a couple of Christian philosophers that walked through and sort of talked about Rome. Although that event is, as we can discuss, was sort of it became sort of a political football. So it's a little bit hard to trust anybody who actually reports on any contemporaries who report on the sack of Rome, because there was sort of a debate between, or a sort of argument between the sort of Christians and the pagans about why it occurred, and they were both sort of,
oh yeah,
they were both
pagans must have pissed off at the Christians. They were doing
exactly. Well, Alaric, the man who sacked it, was a Christian, and Rome had recently converted to Christianity, but there were still many pagans there, and so of course the pagans argued that the sack was sort of the god's revenge, and and so they were apt to amplify the destruction, and the Christians, on the other hand, were sort of sought to play it down, and they said, oh, well, Eric was actually a pretty good guy, and he sort of took mercy on those who hid amongst the churches. And so it was this, it's sort of interesting if you read these old accounts of it, it's sort of like a political football, sort of,
well,
very politicized topic.
On these disasters that were human originated, I always thought, you always think history is written by the winners, but in the book, it, actually, that's not necessarily true. I mean, it's kind of even-handed almost. Like, a perfect example is, jumping ahead, is in the fall of Constantinople, and that those one guys, you'll tell me the name, that were hanging out in the corner that fought so well that they said, you know what, you guys really kicked ass. We're just going to, who are,
yeah, there was some,
let's skip ahead to that.
Yeah, there were some after the city fell. They were sort of in this era, a sack was sort of women, children, anybody who was in a city was considered the same as a combatant. And so there was a sort of brutal 3-day ransacking of the city, which isn't unusual for the time. But there were a couple of Crete warriors from the island of Crete who were there helping the city, and they sort of walled themselves off into a couple of towers near the port, and by sort of using the stairwells as a way to constrict the attackers, they were able to fight all the way until late in the afternoon of the day of the sack, and fought so well and inflicted so much damage that the Ottomans basically said that if they would stop and leave, they would allow them to sail away, and that's what happened, and they were the last people to leave the city of Constantinople, the last defenders. And so as I suggest, there's a few other ways that you could survive, but if worse comes to worse, the best way is to hide out amongst these Cretes.
Yeah, I know, it's kind of like, it reminded me of like Ethan Hawke and that other guy up in the tower in the Magnificent Seven,
Yeah, exactly. Or sort of like that, or the movie 300 on a smaller scale.
Oh yeah, right.
He used the natural constriction to help themselves.
Yeah, just thrown that spear slightly further to the right, things would have turned out differently. So the one that's my favorite, because I have a whole collection of books back here, is the plague. I love the plague, but it's just that, as I was saying in the introduction, if you just, all of a sudden you feel a flea on you when you wake up one morning, and then you don't end up going to bed that night.
Yeah, a lot of people call this sort of the most catastrophic event in human history. It was as the more evidence we uncover, the more devastating it appears this was. It was and I in the book I focus on the Black Death in London, although it hit all of Europe. This is in 1348. We actually know the exact date that it arrived. On June 25th, a sickened sailor arrived in port, and over the next 18 months, 40% of London died. This is 100,000 people living in the city at the time. So the scale of the devastation is basically unimaginable. And as I was sort of as I advise you, and they didn't know it traveled by flea bite, but it did primarily. It was a flea-borne disease, and fleas were on the rats, and then as the rats would die off from the plague, these fleas would start hunting for other sources of food, and that includes was humans basically. And so basically what you need to do is avoid fleas. And you might think, if you were in London at the time, that the best idea would be to run to a small village, but this would actually be a mistake, because the real these villages suffered worse death rates actually than the city, because farming villages were sort of rat infested, and with very few humans. So when the rat colonies died off to the plague, and there would be few humans, that you would be absolutely these humans were flea magnets. So you should actually, unless you were very wealthy, the sort of very wealthy had these sort of manors out in the outskirts of town that were rat free. Unless you knew somebody like that or had one of those, it would actually be safer to hide out in the city. And then you take some basic flea precautions, sort of tuck in your pants to your socks and wear long sleeves, and bathe frequently. At the time they thought that bathing would open the spores and make the disease easier to catch, which is of course the exact opposite. You should absolutely bathe frequently and check yourself for fleas. And then another surprising thing is, I thought maybe it would be a good idea to get a cat or to have set up a bunch of rat traps, but that's actually also a very bad idea, because the only thing more dangerous than a live rat near you is a dead one, because again, that forces its fleas to sort of hop onto you or your cat. So it's best to stay in and then within London, there are safer areas. You want to be in the cleaner parts of town, which was generally the south, where there's sort of less garbage and less rat attracting refuse and stuff. But other than that, it's sort of avoid fleas and hope for the best.
The thing that was one of the other paradoxes in your book was you talk about the rebound of London, like it was almost a blessing in disguise in a way.
Yeah, this was really remarkable. What actually happened, even though 40% of the city died, which you would think would lead to sort of an economic devastation, but actually the exact opposite occurred. There was a huge rebound and improvement in the quality of life, because at the time, London and Europe was under a sort of what they call a Malthusian economy, which is that it was based on fixed resources. This is sort of before the Industrial Revolution. So we can think of their economy as a pie, and the more people, the smaller the slice for each person. There's sort of intense competition amongst laborers, so intense that basically half of England was living under serfdom, which is a system of oppression just north of slavery. A landowner at the time said serfs basically own nothing but their own bellies. And immediately after the plague, and after so many workers died, the competition for laborers to work farms increased, which sort of granted them more bargaining power. And there's a lot of effort actually amongst the landowners in the post-plague era to try to suppress wages. There was even a few laws passed to try to keep wages of the serfs down, but those mostly failed, and there was serfdom basically dropped in half right after the plague, and then slowly from there dwindled to nothing. So basically, if you can survive the plague and you emerge after it, there's going to be a better market for your labor, and quality of life actually improves.
Yeah, it's kind of like the job market now. It's like, Congress has taken 40 years to raise the minimum wage, and it's the COVID epidemic that automatically did it on its own.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting and difficult to predict effects from these. In Eastern Europe, for example, after the plague, the landowners were more effective in suppressing wages, and so quality of life actually didn't improve. It's sort of more money just flowed to the top, but for whatever reason in Western Europe, the laborers were more successful, and quality of life for the average person rose quite a bit.
That reminds me. So yeah, so you could almost like semi write your own check if you want it to work because they needed to have workers, which reminds me of the chapter about Blackbeard, because we can go into it in more detail, but with regard to pirates, I had no idea that they essentially lived in a democratic state because they weren't conscripted. They did this on their own. And there was kind of like honor among thieves. And you even give us a written rule book.
Yeah, these surprisingly, pirates had a far higher quality of life and than their counterparts who were working on these trade ships, and they were far more democratic. They voted on their captains. Their captains had far less power than the captain of a merchant vessel would have had at the time, far less disciplinary power. These were only in times of war, interestingly, or in times of when they were actually attacking another ship, did the captains have unilateral power. Every other time there was votes on where they were going to sail, who they were going to attack. And there are some economic reasons for this. There's sort of, or as an economist would say, there's sort of, there was less need for, there was less competition amongst pirates. It was actually quite difficult to establish a pirate ship. These had massive, they required a lot of investment. They were lots of people. These ships had like 100 or 200 people on them sometimes. It would require a ship and a cannon, and there was very little competition amongst pirates for the business, if we say, of attacking other ships. There was only a few pirate ships at the time, so there was less need for fighting amongst each other. And there's also some argument about why they had such good democracies. It's partly was probably a response to the terrible conditions that most of them were escaping from, which was these merchant vessels that were brutal. The captains would have unilateral power to, this is sort of where the cat of nine tails comes from, and they would sometimes kill, had power to sometimes kill their workers if they didn't, if they were displeased with what they were doing. So there was, I think there's no question they would actually be better to be a pirate as far as quality of life was concerned than to be a merchant vessel, and the money was actually enormous. Some of these vessels, one of the most famous one stole more than $160 million in today's money from a single ship. Another one went down when Sam Bellamy's pirate ship Whydah sank off of Cape Cod. It's since been discovered with more than 4 tons of gold and silver on it. So it was actually quite lucrative, as well as better quality of life.
But it wasn't, it's amazing because, you'd load all this stuff on a ship, which is dangerous in itself just because of the weight. And then it was just a crapshoot of whether you were going to get home or not, one storm. But that goes to Magellan. And that makes me think we can't not talk about scurvy because well, you can talk about it, but the idea that there's all these dumbasses that figured out what it was, but then screwed up figuring it out.
It's really a great mystery. Scurvy is your body. We are one of the few mammals actually that requires vitamin C. Most mammals sort of produce it naturally, but we need an outside source of vitamin C to make collagen, which is basically the glue of our bodies. And without it, you quite literally just sort of fall apart. It's quite gruesome. You don't need very much of it. Just a little tiny bit every few months is enough, so it's a very unusual disease, and it doesn't come up unless you're eating, unless you're under a situation in which you have no fresh food for months on end. So it doesn't really, other than a few really desperate crusades, scurvy didn't crop up until long ship voyages became possible, sort of starting in the 16th century. And once it did, it was absolutely devastating. By some estimates, more than 4 million sailors died of it. And it's really confusing in some ways, because even the very first ships some people seem to have discovered that what was happening in the cure. Some of these Portuguese ships that first started suffering from scurvy, they have in their diaries, we can see some of the sailors were demanded fresh limes or fresh fruit seemed to be the cure. But if you look at it a little bit more closely, so in some respects, we sort of think that how could these fools not understand what was going on? But if you do look at it a little more closely, there are some odd aspects of scurvy and vitamin C that would have thrown people off. And sort of the manner in which you preserve it, if you heat it up, which was often it's a common way, basically pasteurization, that destroys the vitamin C. So you can imagine thinking that we'll have juice is going to save you, and you heat it up and it didn't, and you would think, okay, that was just a myth, another myth of the sea. Even the manner in which you store it, if you store it in copper, that happens to destroy the vitamin C. So there are some reasons why you could see why it would be difficult to understand the exact cure.
And the most important advice you give me is to have a suitcase full of quince jam.
Yeah. So on Magellan's voyage,
At the beginning, I was thinking, why is he saying that?
Yeah, on Magellan's voyage, it turns out one of the perks of being one of the captains or the first lieutenants were that they got a little bit of quince, which is basically just an apple or a type of jam. And the reason was it's sort of a perk. It was a little bit of sugar for those in charge, and the crewmen did not. Unbeknownst to them, this quince has a little bit of just enough vitamin C to keep you alive on these long voyages. So when Magellan first left the passage in Chile and started across what he thought was going to be a narrow crossing of the Pacific Ocean, which was obviously the largest ocean in the world, and his sailors began to die of scurvy. If you were an officer, you had a little bit of quince, and that kept him and the other officers alive. And so if you're one of those sailors, I suggest stowing away a bit of quince before you go.
The other thing that struck me throughout this is that how intelligent everyone was, more intelligent than I ever thought that people would be, except you give a recitation of ancient Greece, and and then we can go to the Dark Ages too. I keep jumping around. So what was I going to say? So my point was, I don't know how Magellan could have done what he did. And you did say he's kind of like the greatest navigator of all time, even though it was a real pain in the butt. But when he's down in Tierra del Fuego, how the hell could you get through that? It's a maze.
It's a maze, and it's dangerous. There's like storms that pop up out of nowhere with these winds coming out of the glaciers. It's a bravery that's almost unimaginable. And the whole time his officers are wanting to turn around. One of them actually does in the middle of a storm, just notices an opportunity to escape, and they sail back for Spain. It was almost, it seems like, had a death wish, which he did eventually fulfill. But it is quite unimaginable how not only his skill in crossing it, but just the way in which he did it. He had no idea where he was going. It was completely dangerous territory, and as he sailed off into what he thought was be a narrow crossing. But I mean, he must have thought he had no idea. He was just assumed it was a narrow crossing. It was obviously completely wrong. It's a scale of bravery it's difficult to imagine, and we can't just attribute it to being a different time, because all of his officers seemingly were quite well aware of how dangerous it was and did not want to do it at all.
It's going back to this concept of intelligence, or in my case, looking at the pyramids and saying this is impossible. It's like, if we go to the Donner Party, that happened because the guy was an idiot. But a lot of the rest of them are like, these people were so intelligent that there's no way I can even begin to fathom how they could have done what they did. I assume that not crossed your mind, but I assume that was a big thing with you when you saw these things. How could they have done this?
Completely. And off topic, but the previous book I wrote, another navigator, I talk about the Polynesians who first explored the Pacific and discovered Hawaii, and it's the methods they use are a mystery still, and it's there's really no explanation other than an incredible intelligence and experience and bravery as to how they did it. Same thing with Magellan.
But it's that same kind of dead end that I did before. The reason why we know about it is because they did it. That's why we're talking about it. If they didn't do it, we wouldn't be talking about it because they weren't as smart as the person who did it.
True, it's sort of a survival bias. I think we also sort of discount naturally the ancient people or people in history because they believe things like bathing would open spores and you would catch the Black Plague. But I don't think that's it's mistaken for lack of intelligence, which it isn't. It's sort of it's not a lot of these things when you think from their perspective are not intuitive at all, and so we shouldn't discount their individual intelligence at all. In fact, as the book illustrates, some of them were absolutely brilliant.
And the converse, of course, we might as well talk about is the Donner Party, where if you could paint yourself into a corner any better than that, I don't know how you could do it.
Right. So, yeah, these were pilgrims crossing on the California-Oregon Trail back in this happened on 1846. We actually know the exact day they made their terrible mistake, which is July 20th. And there was they were part of a large group, and then there was a sort of rumor going around of a shortcut that was, if you look at the trail now, it sort of goes north into Idaho. It takes a little roundabout route, avoiding Utah, and a pioneer named Andrew Hastings had suggested that there was a shortcut and you could just go straight through Utah. And he convinced a small band of people to take this shortcut. Didn't convince most people, but for whatever reason, this small band seemed to think that was a good idea. Took the shortcut, and what he had said was a trail was basically just a line he drew on a map. There was no trail there at all, and they basically had to haul their wagons and bushwhack their way across these sort of completely nearly impassable mountains and deserts, and after it cost them more than 6 weeks of time and basically all their food stores. So when they arrived in what is now Reno, they were a little late. But then they got unlucky too, as there was a sort of early snowstorm that happens once every 10 years. It actually happened this year. In fact, I live in San Francisco, and we had an early cold rainstorm that came through that dumped a few feet of snow on Lake Tahoe, and it was pretty much the same storm that trapped them. Was an unusually early, unusually heavy snow that fell in, and so they were trapped up at Donner Lake, basically the top of the Sierras for an entire winter. And these people were not mountain men; they were farmers, and so there's very little food up there, even if you were experienced, and if you're not, there was nothing. So they just for a summer they starved.
Yeah, and before we get into the taboo, that you are, interestingly enough, you don't make a moral judgment about it, which is interesting. We can talk about that. But one of the things I wanted to mention, and you do in your acknowledgments too, is the illustrations in the book, which are instructive and very funny. And the one is, like you said, he just drew a line, and you have the illustration where it's just a line. And also when you go here, don't go here. So those were great. They were really made a difference.
Well, when you look at it on a map, you could see why the Donner Party did it. It definitely looks more direct. Unfortunately, when there's no road.
Yeah. Well, that's history too. It's just whoever draws the line, you know. So anyway, the taboo. So cannibalism and eating each other. And you talk about taboos, that evolution essentially instituted the taboo against incest because of the fact that, it screws up the genetic pool. But there's no specific evolutionary reason for a taboo against cannibalism.
Yeah, I found this interesting. Donner Party is famous for cannibalization, which they did, but less known is that a number of them died. Quite a few died without cannibalizing at all. Basically, they starved to death, and they refused to cannibalize those who had already died and were there. And so I sort of became interested in the power of this taboo that we have against cannibalization. And as you say, it is a Western culture taboo. It's not pan-human. There's certainly many cultures in history that practice ritualized cannibalization, and sort of became interested in how a taboo could become so powerful that people like those in the Donner Party would refuse to do it, and even at the point of death. And so I sort of dove into it, and it sort of turns it comes probably from the ancient Greeks, and there's an interesting theory that was sort of the Greeks were in competition with their neighbors who did practice cannibalism, and the Greeks did not. And so this is pretty common in human cultures, that we sort of demonize our foreigners or enemies based on what they eat. So in this case, they ate people sometimes, and so they were demonized for that, and the practice of eating people was demonized for that. And you can see that in a lot of these ancient Greek myths and stories, or sort of the monster is usually the one who's cannibalizing the Greek warriors. And then that sort of
even going back to Kronos.
Exactly. And then that sort of wrapped up with some religious ideas about how we treat the dead, into this quite powerful Western taboo against cannibalization. And that sort of brought us to these members of the Donner Party who were quite religious, and who and many of them, as I said, simply refused to eat people to survive. And some of them did not, and those who did not did survive. But I found it more interesting because, at least here, the Donner Party is very famous for being cannibals, and it was, to me, interesting that a lot of them were not.
At the bookstore, we have lots of book clubs. One's a nonfiction one, which I'll recommend this book to be in. But I always like the idea that there's always two sides. And I know when it gets to the cannibal part, they're going to go, how dare he say that human flesh tastes like veal? What kind of thing is that to say in a book? And there'll be others, well, no, he's just explaining what it was, and I always look forward to those fights.
Yeah, I mean, you can see the taboo is quite powerful. Even just speaking about it is, or reading about it can be revolting. But yeah, I sort of looked into what it would be like, and there's a somewhat gruesome experiment by a journalist in the 1920s or something. He really decided to go and test it out, and so he found some. I don't exactly remember where he found it. I think it was through moral means, but wrote a whole article about what it was like.
Yeah, it's like when you're talking about the different parts of the body. It's like Voltaire and Candide, when they cut off the parts of the buttocks of the young women, because those were the best part to eat. Well, we can't end with cannibalism. Let's see. I got to take these out because so we did the dinosaurs at Pompeii. So we pretty much covered everything except two of the coolest ones and the most recent. So let's just do that and then we'll end. So the San Francisco earthquake, which is another amazing one caused by a natural event, but a good portion of it was man-made because of the gas.
Yeah, well, yeah, the San Francisco earthquake, this happened in 1906. It was the plate broke off just right near where the Golden Gate Bridge is now. And it and sort of a 7.8 earthquake, which is almost as powerful as the fault line here can produce, shook San Francisco. And because of how the city is built, which is a lot of the low-lying areas are old marsh beds, and sort of the bay they're not on bedrock, they're sort of filled in through alluvium and from the outflow of the bay, so that the ground is actually quite unstable. And during the earthquake, the lowlands liquefied basically, and all sorts of the buildings collapsed, and that was quite bad in of itself. But as you say, the really destructive part was that basically every water line and gas main in the city severed. I mean, this was a quite large jump. The North American plate or the Pacific plate jumped 15 feet forward relative to the North American plate. So you can imagine what that'll do to the piping in the city. And so more than 50 fires broke out, mostly in the southern portion of the city. And when the firefighters went to put them out, there was no water running through the city either. So these the fires just burned uncontrollably and raged through the southern portion, mostly warehouses at the time, empty buildings. There were even some stockyards. There's sort of cattle started charging through the street, which I suggest that you take cover from, actually, if you're trying to escape. But then the fire was basically unstoppable, and further compounding the problem was that there was the military garrison at the time in the northern part of the city. It was garrisoned by a sort of a man who was wasn't about to let the city go to chaos without him having some say over it. So he basically ordered the largest peacetime military occupation of a U.S. city in history, where he sort of ordered all of his troops into the city to try to maintain order and try to prevent looting, which is unclear whether it even happened, but they ended up shooting more than 100 people. Probably it's no one will ever really say, but shot a lot of people running through the city with who they were sort of suspecting of looting, or may have just been trying to save their own things. It's not too many questions were asked. And then the military, as well as the fire department, started detonating buildings to try to create a fire line, because without water, they thought that would be the best way to try to stop the fire.
But some things, like I was saying in the introduction, when you think of what's happening in the news today about some Uber guy arriving at the wrong door, or someone pulling into the wrong driveway and then they just get shot, it almost reminded me of that. If you're not sure whether they're looting, just shoot them.
Yeah, that was basically the policy. Anybody running with stuff in their hands, which was almost everybody. Bankers were sort of carting their money out and by the wheelbarrow. This is sort of the first Bank of America, actually, was the founder was running out with a horse and wagon with all of his money and gold in the back, just evacuating it before the fire came.
I remember I read a book about the ship that was, I think it was in the Galapagos, and they had gotten so many specimens, and they sailed back to San Francisco, and obviously the Museum of Natural History was destroyed. They got back 3 days after the earthquake, and so all their specimens were intact, and they were able to put them in.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic time.
Okay, the last one. Thinking of the Titanic, the thing I liked best about that was something you said about, like, you can make a movie of indeterminable length, which reminds me of James Cameron, and I hate that movie so much. But so that resonated with me. And yeah, the other thing, again, it's one of those things where I cannot believe this. Okay, the temperature is as cold as water can get without freezing. And these people survived. 5, 6, 7 people actually stayed in the water until the Carpathia. Was that right? What's that?
Carpathia, yeah.
Until the Carpathia arrived. And I don't see how that's actually possible.
Well, yeah, the people who survived in the water were all people who, I hate to invoke the movie that you hate so much, but somehow managed to get a little bit above the water. Like no evidence of anybody being on a door, but there were a couple of overturned life rafts that a few of the crew and the passengers survived. So you certainly would have to get out of the water. You have about the water is 27 degrees, and it takes 45 minutes in that kind of water to basically go into cardiac arrest, but you actually have quite a lot less than that, because after about 15 minutes, your sort of arms and legs will become so numb that you won't be able to swim. And so I suggest, if you're in the water, you do need to find a way out of it quickly. But the life rafts were floating about 500 yards off of the side of the wreck. So if you're a strong swimmer, you can make 15 yards or 500 yards in 15 minutes, which is what I suggest.
They let you on. And the other thing that I didn't know was that you don't want to dive into the water because if your head goes under, you can't not gasp. And once you gasp,
Yeah, it's something called it's something called the cold shock response, which is sort of cause an uncontrollable gasp, and for the first 30 seconds or something, you're probably not going to be able to move. It's so shocking. So the best way and safest way to enter water that cold is to actually keep your head above the entire time to make sure that you don't swallow in a bunch of water as you go under.
That's tough to do, especially when you're saying head for the stern, right? Head for the stern.
Yeah. Fortunately, there wasn't the suction effect that I think is portrayed in the movie.
Yeah.
And you would actually sort of intuitively think that doesn't seem to have occurred. And there was actually a few survivors' testimonies saying they went down right at the end, and they kept their head above water the entire time. There was no effect. I do suggest you wear your life jacket, though. They were issued, and they were sort of kept above the bunks. So you should put that on before you leave.
And as you said, put on a tuxedo as well if you have access to one.
Certainly, yeah. Dress in your finest clothing, because they kept the lifeboats on the first class deck, and in the early stages, particularly of the wreck, which is your best chance to get a seat. There was a sort of invitation only thing going on there. So if you look the part, I think you have a better chance of getting aboard.
The two things that are kind of cliches now, but I still admire them both so much, is the band continuing to play on the song that's either whatever near my sea, and then the guy with the gun who said, if you try to get in here, I'm going to shoot you. He fired the warning shot. Those two things always made me think of nobility.
Yeah, there was a lot of gallantry on the sinking of the Titanic, which is one of the reasons I think it's so famous, and also was really interesting to me because it's not generally how ships sink. Particularly in that era, oftentimes they're sort of chaotic and go down quite quickly. And the Titanic was called unsinkable. Obviously, that was wrong, but it did have a lot of safety features that enabled it to sink so slowly and elegantly. And I mean, it's more than 2 hours that the boat has, and it never really tilts even too much off of its angle. This is because they put they call bulkheads in the hull of the ship that sort of section the ship off into little partitions, and that enable to segregate the water. So if there's a hole in the boat, it stays and only floods a portion rather than the entire hull. It happened to cut the iceberg happened to gash a hole into behind too many different partitions. So the boat did end up sinking, but these safety features did enable this sort of elegant, graceful descent, which enabled all sorts of sort of this human drama to play out on its decks, which, as you say, the band and all sorts of, which is why I think it's famous and made for a movie.
And Vanderbilt, I guess it was saying, at least we'll go down as gentlemen or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of very British, stiff upper lip sort of thing.
And then the other thing which I didn't know was, I did know that the bulkhead had walls, and if just 4 compartments had been flooded, it would have been okay. It was the 5th one. But what I didn't know was, if the walls had been higher, the water wouldn't have sloshed over, and that did it. But at the same time, there's a reason for that too.
Yeah, had the walls been, and they actually retrofitted the Titanic had a sister ship, and after the wreck, they raised the walls. Had the walls been just 20 feet higher, it would have, as it was designed, it could only flood into 4 behind 4. If a hole was cut into 4 bulkheads, it would sink. And had the walls been higher, it would have been able to go into 5. Sort of, as you can imagine, what happens when the bulkhead floods is that the hole is dragged down a little bit, so the water level rises, and the more bulkheads flood, the harder the water rises. And so once it gets above the bulkheads, they're useless. It pours over them, and it pours over the next one as the boat is sinking. So yeah, it could have been 20 or even 20 feet higher. And there was actually no design reason for it not to be. It just makes the interior of the ship a little bit more awkward for passengers, but there's no reason otherwise for them not to be, and it would have saved the ship.
Well, I never thought we'd do it, but even with my irrelevant sidetracks. We got through pretty much every chapter. Me segueing in from Blackbeard to Magellan, that helped. But anyway, thank you so much. It was a great book. I really loved it, and I look forward to selling it. Oh, what did I say? Did I say it comes out June 13th, I think. It's published by Penguin.
Yep, okay. June 13th.
All right, well, hey, do you have a copy there that you can hold up the cover?
Man, that would have been, well, just a second.
All right, take your time.
They just sent me these, so I do in fact have a copy.
Yeah, and again, as a bookseller, that's the most important thing that you could have done in this entire. Hold it up again, so it's like still.
Sorry, here it is.
Yeah, so it's a great cover, and it's this guy, me. I keep thinking it's me running as fast as he can, which is either going to be a good thing or a bad thing. So, yeah, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. This was fun.
Yeah, I agree. All right.